Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Critical Realism Network webinar series. This week, we're very happy to have Steve Hitlin joining us from the University of Iowa. For those of you who don't know Steve, he is a social psychologist who's done a great deal of work on morality and has been really one of the central figures in the new sociology of morality, which has been growing by leaps and bounds in recent years. And indeed, he is one of the co-editors of the handbook of sociology of morality, which is a very good first stop for anybody who's trying to get up to speed in the field. He's joining us today from from the University of Iowa, where he is a professor in the sociology department. And this will be the first in a series of webinars that we'll be doing this spring that will be broadly concerned with issues around morality, values, normativity, and politics. But Steve is going to give us a sort of overview of where he thinks the field is at right now, and also give us some sense of where the leading edge of work in the sociology of morality is by discussing a couple of his current projects. So as for those of you who are veterans will know that you can submit questions for Steve at any time, just by hitting the Ask a Question tab that'll be showing up typically in the upper left-hand side of your screen. You can certainly chat with one another if you want, but in terms of questions that you'd like me to pass on to Steve, please do use that Ask a Question tab instead. And so without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Steve.
Well, thank you, Phil, and thank you for everybody who is listening to this. I'm going to try it. This is a new format for me, so I look forward to comments and questions along the way. I'm going to try to probably cover a little too much ground, but what I want to talk about first is sort of social science views, I would say, of morality. And then a bit of what we think sociology should be doing, could or should be doing, and then as Phil mentioned, I'll talk about a couple of projects I'm on. And so the variety of things here I've done in collaboration with other people. I will hopefully give due credit as I get to them. Steve Vasey, who is a professor of sociology at Duke, has done a lot of this sort of big picture thinking with me. He's a sociologist of culture, and so we both agree on things and totally don't agree on a variety of things, and we've tried to sort of sketch out what's going on. So a little bit of just background. People that know more economics than me will discuss sort of Adam Smith's centrality and the invisible hand theory he has, which is sort of what modern economics is based on, seems to entirely omit his other main idea, and he only thought that the invisible hand would work if we took seriously the fact that human beings were moral creatures. And so a few economists have been making the case that perhaps the theory that they use of Smith is incomplete, and we need a better understanding of the fact that human beings are fundamentally moral creatures. When I talk about morality, especially to my undergraduate classes, I like to start with this scale, which was done by a couple of psychologists. Graham and Haidt has done a lot of important work in morality, and they have a different purpose with this. They're trying to do a different exercise, but I think it gets us started into whatever understanding what morality is, because it's one of those terms that means what you want it to mean for lots of uses. So what they do is they ask a variety of questions. I've picked out a few samples, and they ask respondents, in their case it's almost always college sophomores, to give an amount of money it would take for them to do these behaviors, which are sort of maladaptive or non-normative. And so would you, for example, kick a dog in the head? It turns out in my class more students would harm babies than dogs. I don't know what that says about Midwestern undergraduates. How much would I have to pay you to stick a pin into the palm of a child you don't know? How much would it take to get you to sign a secret but binding pledge to only hire people of your race? Haidt and Graham suggest that there are different traditions here and that American liberals and conservatives have different things on this. At the bottom of purity, right, how much would I have to pay you to sign a piece of paper that says I sell my soul after death to whoever has this piece of paper? They are doing a different exercise, as I mentioned, but what I like to point out to the people I'm talking to is for some of these possible moral pledges or moral actions, there is no money that you would take to do these things. Whatever it is that you will not put into an economic calculus is where I like to start for suggesting what morality is, either for you or in your groups or in your society. So John Stewart has a joke about this where basically, which I probably won't repeat to a bunch of strangers, but the point is if you're willing to negotiate the price, we're in one frame. And if we are outside of an economic frame, then we're talking about something else. And to me, that's the center of what would count as morality. Albert Bandura, who is one of the more important psychologists living, has done some work on morality, and he separates it into these two aspects, right? So one part is what he calls the inhibitive elements, which I just call the thou shalt nots. I think 7 of the 10 commandments are about thou shalt not do something. And then there are some proactive elements of morality. And so there are duties, and philosophers argue what these are, what your moral duties are. And then there are ideals. And in some of my work, I've probably spent more time on these ideals and the values and the things that would be good in a world of complicated, possibly conflicting choices. What are the priorities that come up? So as an empirical social psychologist, this starts to help me get to the point where I can ask some questions about what's going on. Morality in any society is intertwined with legality, but is not the same. And so I just want to make that point that some things that are moral are not illegal and are illegal, and a lot of what happens in legal debates is trying to figure out in a society what the moral point is. All right, so a lot of the work that I've done and with Steve Vasey came out of the fact that I'll say somewhere around 2001, John Haidt, the psychologist, published a really influential article trying to bring dual system psychology, which is the idea of how our brains are working, into psychology and using that to undergird the understanding of morality. And then this discussion of morality sort of spread into lots of popular media, in which if this part of the brain lights up, then Time Magazine says you're immoral or you're asocial. There's a lot of things going on. And it was very limited. It was very focused on the brain. And the other Steve, as I like to call him, and myself, tried to say, sociology was once rather centrally concerned with morality. It seems to have waned as a movement in the time before we each kind of entered the discipline, and so we're trying to give a framework to bring it back in. And so Durkheim, for those of you that are not aware, if there was a Mount Rushmore of sociologists, Durkheim would have to be on it. And he thinks that the moral code that we can observe in people, or infer at least I should say from people, is centrally and inextricably located to the structure of society. And so people can argue about that, but this goes way, way, way back. All right, so we suggest first off in our handbook, and then we have an annual review paper in 2013 in which we spell this out a little more. We say there's not enough morality in sociology. It's not a moral statement itself, but at least in terms of the topic studied. The first sort of data point that I like to point to for this is that when Adam Smith was writing, the words social and moral were relatively interchangeable. Right? To be social was to be part of a moral community. And Durkheim, who was writing about moral facts, shifted to using the word social to align with Comte and people that were more famous. And so from one tradition, we could be called moralology. I guess it's good that we switched, but the fact that morality is central to the human experience, I think, goes way back. We talk rather crudely in this paper, the Annual Review of Sociology paper, about two broad traditions. Again, we're oversimplifying, but you can focus on the ways that morality holds a group or society together. That would be what we call the Durkheimian approach. And we can contrast that with the Weberian, which would focus on in any given society or social system, there are probably conflicting moralities in play, and so that it is incorrect. And what the psychologists often do as a broad critique is sort of pick a kind of morality and beat it to death. And we're suggesting that what you consider moral has a lot to do with where you are located in society and your experiences and your group's experiences and so forth. A major distinction that this group might be quite interested in, and Chris Smith talks about this and Andrew Sayer, they take the position that the famous philosophical distinction between what is going on and what ought to be should not be made. Right, so that to understand the human organism and human society, we should talk about those things that make societies and humans flourish, and so that we can say some sorts of moralities are better than others. Personally, I have a lot of, I don't know where I come down on this myself. I was telling Phil before this, I have a 9-month-old baby, and I'm certainly not going to try to teach him that there's just a series of moralities in the world to choose from. There's a way that we want the world to be. At the same time, as a social scientist, I get kind of nervous suggesting this is the type of morality that's out there. And so Steve and I think, stay a bit agnostic on this professionally, but some of the work of the critical realism scholars does nudge me towards maybe I should be a little less cautious in what I claim personally. So when we try to bring a sociology of morality back, what can we add to the social science discussion? Maybe it will get back to the philosophers. I don't know if they ever look at what we do. But we, in sociology, fundamentally look at things like social structure and power and resources, and so we think that influences people's moral development, moral codes, the way we justify our immoral behaviors, and so forth. A lot of what's happened in psychology and a bit into anthropology is a focus on, going back to Kohlberg, if you know that name, on morality is just fundamentally about justice or causing harm, and we want to say that people's moral lives, people's moral concerns are certainly fundamentally, or at least centrally concerned with things like that, but might be broader and might not even be as coherent in practice as people suggest they are. And we're aiming for, we hope, in a sociology of morality, some more ecological validity that I'll talk about. Psychologists like fMRI machines, and they like laboratory experiments, and you can learn a lot from that, but real people focusing on real problems don't always have time to take a survey and decide what their moral code is like. So if you look through a social psychology textbook, Chris Smith did this in one of his books, you don't find much about morality itself. You will find some discussions of altruism, whether we help each other or not. And my advisor, Jane Pilyavin's done a lot of great work on how altruism develops and how it plays out in society. But we want to get to something a little bit broader than that, a little bit deeper. And so I personally draw from the developmental psychologist Jerome Kagan, who argues that the capacity to understand oneself as good or bad is a distinctively human thing. It's at the fundamental root of what it means to be human, to have this intersubjective knowledge and to evaluate it. And I'll talk more about that in one of my projects. And so, you know, morality becomes more than just whether we help or hurt people. It has to do with all sorts of normative and non-normative behaviors. Gabi Abend, who's a sociologist at NYU, has written some excellent stuff on morality, and he argues that the psychological work has been on what he says is largely a thin understanding of morality. So primary basic emotions and how they are affected by, you know, unfairness or getting angry or racism. It's a very simple, I shouldn't say simple, but very sort of direct first order reactions. And what Gabi points out is that what we really need in sociology is a thick morality. So he gives examples of revenge and pride and contempt and dignity and pettiness and sorts of things that are part of the human experience and the social structured experience and aren't as easily categorized by what many of the psychological experiments. I also, as a social psych person, enjoy Ann Rawls' interpretation of Goffman's ASR paper, his presidential speech in 1983, when he talks about the interaction order, sort of the fundamental mutual accountability that human beings have for each other. She argues that he's arguing that that's a moral order, that human beings are morally answerable to each other for acting in the ways that our society deems appropriate. And so when he's discusses in detail what those pressures are, Rawls points out that there's a moral level to that interpretation. All right. So we suggest sort of three things that distinguish what sociologists can add to the social science understanding of morality. The first, and this may be worth discussing later on here, would be the definition. So rather than discovering morality itself and how it happens when people enter particular moral dilemmas, sociologists will often back up and understand that there's some variation in what gets classified as moral. So the fundamental object of study, it can be slippery. Things that are acceptable today were not acceptable in history, and vice versa. And so as sociologists, we should not assume a definition, we're arguing, but we should sort of look at what the people under exploration consider morality. Secondly, we break this down. Again, these are sort of crude organizing principles, but we hope that they're useful to people. Morality, whatever your code is, or codes, if they're even coherent, we don't necessarily think that they have to be, that they come from places. There are patterns in their development, and so there may be patterns by gender. Michel Lamont has a lot of work talking about sort of the intersection of social class and culture in terms of shaping particular understandings of morality. And so we think we can add to the conversation by looking at where these, for what these beliefs are, and then where they come from. And then third, we can look at morality in sort of a crass empiricist way. Does it do anything? Right? So in the laboratory, people with X moral judgments might act more likely to act a certain way than people with Y judgments, and that sort of thing. And we can learn from that. And there are sociologists studying things like the moral identity who argue that a particular conception of morality does lead to certain kinds of outcomes and whatnot. Some of Steve's work suggests that we have these codes in us, we just can't articulate them, but if we can measure them, we can predict people's behavior. But we also want to understand people across time, because we may or may not have the same moral codes in the same situations or in the different parts of our life course, and in real context. So some of the best work in what we would consider the sociology of morality comes from sort of ethnographic treatments of people in particular places or organizations or universities, whatnot, adjudicating for themselves or trying to figure out what are the criteria that let them adjudicate things, morality. So we are not alone in this, so we may be wrong or deranged in some way, but there are other sociologists that have done some important studies in the sociology of morality. They may not consider themselves part of this group or part of this umbrella, but we sort of have a broad tent mindset, so we bring some people in. So this is just a subset, including some narcissistic plugs for my own work. So in practice, we can talk, this becomes, okay, so what do we do with this outcome? So I'm going to give, hopefully, appropriately brief overviews of two different projects that I'm working on. One is looking at morality more at the societal level in kind of an interesting and hopefully convincing way, and then a different project where we're getting very individualistic and sort of focusing on people's subjective senses of dignity. So, again, this is another sort of self-plug. This work that I've been doing with my colleague here at Iowa, Sarah Harkness. I believe the book comes out tomorrow, available. It's well overpriced at all places that books can be found online, as academic books tend to be, from Oxford University Press. We're making an argument in here based on a linking that we suggest that the language of a particular society tells us something about the way that society is structured. It's a very Durkheimian argument, and what we're using is emotion as an indicator. And so I haven't yet talked about emotion, but the sociological approach to morality suggests that these moral codes are one of the ways that society what John Turner says, society gets its teeth into us, right? So it's one thing to have certain moral reactions to the world or moral judgments, but that you need that sort of sense of guilt or shame or pride to actually impel us to behave in certain ways or not to behave in certain ways. A recent study by Costa et al., some psychologists, talk about how people are making moral judgments, and they look at people who are bilingual, and that their argument is one's native language is the place in which we develop a very emotional sense of the world. And so words in our native language, words, concepts, norms, and such, have these teeth. And in a second language, people are much more logical. They use sort of the logical part of the brain in interpreting sort of moral decisions they could make or whatnot. And so we point to this as suggestion that using people's senses of emotion can tell us something deeper about their place in society, and we're hoping about those society themselves. What we do here, I don't actually always advocate, but it's a particular approach, a particular kind of data in which we're collapsing entire societies into categories. So we have American English, Canadian English, German, Japanese, and Chinese as our sample. I can explain that in a bit. And we're arguing that there are some central tendencies in each culture, even though, of course, there's a lot of diversity. But for this point, like I said, it's a Durkheimian argument. I guess the beauty of tenure is that we begin the book by saying we are going to make an intentionally strong argument that is supported by the data, but is certainly not proven by the data, in order to hopefully motivate some other inquiries. And so we begin this book by discussing what moral emotions are. So it's not just emotions in general. Moral emotions are those that arise, classic sociology, when people meet or break the moral expectations in their society and in particular situations. Stetson Carter, social psychologists, have argued that they signal something's wrong in the situation when you have this kind of moral emotion. There's a deep something has gone incorrect. Now, we were trying to figure out how to categorize these emotions, and luckily for us, a psychological overview and these sociologists, John Turner and Jan Stetz, independently came up with sort of similar groups of about 4 kinds of moral emotions. So they separate moral emotions that they call other condemning, so judgment of others. They differentiate those from the self-conscious moral emotions, so shame and guilt about how you're living up to your actions. Then they suggest that there are emotions that are concerned about others suffering, and then there are emotions that appear that are about praising others, sort of elevating our views of others. And so, as I've mentioned, as an empirical social psychologist, I try to take sort of the philosophical categories and how do we get a handle on them and test them in some way. So when we do this, we start looking at cultures, and I won't go through all of these various theories, but the psychology of culture, oddly enough, less than in sociology, has theories about how cultures are organized. So I will just talk about the first and the last thesis here so as to save some time. But for example, perhaps the most prominent division of cultures in psychology suggests that there are Eastern versus Western ways of experiencing the world. And so what they argue in this tradition, and I believe this paper I just looked up for another project has been cited 18,000 times, so it's very influential. They're arguing that Easterners and Westerners looking at this particular scene describe it in different ways. And so Westerners, especially Americans, is sort of the most supposedly individualistic culture out there, will discuss the big fish in the front of this particular scene, whereas Easterners, when they ask people from Japan and China and Korea to discuss this scene, they will discuss a much more holistic description of what's going on, and they'll point out the little frog in the bottom and the trees that are waving, and their argument is that we fundamentally perceive the world differently based on which culture that we're in. Now, there's some pushback to that, which we could get into, but in terms of our idea of let's test whether or not moral emotions tell us something about culture, this would be the thesis we would have to sort of argue with. What we end up with is a thesis that we suggest is much more tied into sociological thinking, and the word inequality has gotten a lot more play in the last couple of years, and then when we started putting this together. But we suggest, for example, you can take the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality in a society. The closer that number is to 0, the more equal economically that society is. And so if you look at the 5 countries that we have data for, you can see that what you get is China and the United States have very high, similar levels of inequality, and then followed by Japan has some inequality, Canada, Germany have less inequality. Right? Nobody has no inequality in sort of the industrialized world, but these are very, very meaningful differences. And so what we're going to try to suggest and make the case for is that this level of structural economic inequality can be found in the emotions that people will report based on this data. I should mention I've been working on this with Dr. Harkness for 8 or 9 years, and I think I largely believe the theory that's behind this that I'll explain, which is known as affect control theory. It's very complicated, and so what I'll do now is try to give a very brief intro, and then if you have more questions, we can talk about those later. Affect control theory argues basically that you can mathematize language. And that all words in any language can be rated along these 3 dimensions. Now, this traces back to Osgood and some anthropological work that's very classical and very well established, that any word in a dictionary, in a language, has three dimensions, right? It has a dimension of evaluation. So that word, whether it's dog or baby or sociology department or whatever the object is, can be evaluated as being good or bad. It can be evaluated as being powerful or powerless, and it is either active or non-active. That one's actually a little hard for me to get my head around sometimes. And so what happens in this tradition is they have gathered mathematical definitions or rankings of most of the words in the language, and that lets them do all sorts of things. So what that looks like, if you go to their program, this was begun by David Heiss at Indiana University, and it's been picked up by a number of people, hundreds of studies on this that have helped convince me that there's something here. What you do is you take a particular word and you ask thousands of people in the culture to rank that word, and so just a sampling of nouns here, you can say what that society thinks about things like whatever's here, stranger, probationer, I have no idea what a sponger is, stepsister, right? All these words get these mathematical ratings. What that gets us, and I have a lot more of these charts if anyone's interested, or you might want to borrow the book out from the library, is that we could take, for example, moral emotions are words that have rankings, and see in these 5 different societies, this is just one of the 3 dimensions, but whether or not the word, like ashamed or remorseful, is seen as good or bad. And so many of these moral emotions in these societies are seen as bad, but there is some variation among the societies about how bad they are. Right? Remorse is not as bad in some societies as it is in others, and yet all societies look at sympathy as a positive emotion. And so what we start doing is we have these ratings for all sorts of emotions and words. So what we did, and I will not bore you with the details, but Sarah Harkness is an expert with this particular theory, is we try to compare the 5 language dictionaries to each other without getting bogged down into the actual words that are being used themselves. And so what we did were hundreds and hundreds of simulations using those numbers and putting the numbers into the algorithm in a way that it won't bother to explain. And what happens is you get an outcome, which is an emotion. And what that's telling you is in that society, what that emotion is the most likely thing to be felt if you put in a sample thing. So mom yells at baby, you can put that into the equation and find out in a particular society what people would suggest the emotion that the mom would be feeling and the baby would be feeling. You can do this in ways, and there are ways we did this to make it comparable across the societies that is way too boring to get into in a non-face-to-face format. But when we do that, so if you'll give me the allowance that this sort of works or that this has some possible validity, you end up with these are the emotions across all 5 societies that are the most commonly felt in these different societies. And so you can see that there's a lot of what were called the other praising emotions, being touched and reverent, things that elevate your interaction partners and sort of bind societies and groups together. Those seem to be the most common moral reactions in societies. You get people that are agitated and shocked, ecstatic and aggravated. Right? So the word cloud gives you a sense of what moral experience is like in all 5 societies together. We have lots and lots and lots and lots of charts in the book. I'm just going to give you one which demonstrates what we think our thesis is saying, which is there are different amounts of moral reactions in different countries. And what we sort of find in these ways is that the patterns do not fit with the East-West distinction in which you would group China and Japan together. But in fact, and this happens again for dozens of kinds of emotions of which I won't grade through, is that the United States and China are consistently similar in terms of the number of emotions and the kind of emotions we have, and we find that the other 3 group differently. And none of the existing theories would put the United States and China together, or Japan, Canada. They wouldn't work the same way. Most theories would put Canada and the United States together because we have very similar languages. And so this is consistent with our basic idea that the inequality of a society is found in the emotions people report using this very strange method. What we find is we're arguing a bit that the societies with more inequality have more of certain kinds of emotions. And so the US and China have more self-criticism and other criticism than the less economically diverse societies. And those in the more equal societies have more of the, and these are all statistically significant, more of the sort of what we would call positive binding moral emotions. And so we do this in a bunch of different ways with a bunch of different ways to cut the data, but what we suggest is that inequality in society is reflected in the kinds of moral emotions that are more prevalent and more likely to appear to people in those societies. And so Sarah summarized this by saying moral sanctioning maintains hierarchy in some way. And so the book is, again, making the case with very incomplete data, but hopefully to spur some other people to challenge us or not, is that the economic inequality we have finds its way into the language and the emotional experience we have. All right, and now if you shake the Etch-a-Sketch of your mind up for something completely different. I'm working on another project with former student Matt Anderson, who's now at Baylor University, who spent some time as a postdoc at Yale, so Phil knows Matt. We, for a while, have been playing with this idea of dignity. And dignity is something that does not, again, come up much in the social psychology of how people work, and yet dignity is referred to a lot in other areas of social science. Organizational and cultural things talk a lot about dignity. And so because we like to try to measure things and see what they are, dignity, like morality, is a word that means what you want it to mean. We sort of dived into seeing, can we get our heads around what dignity is, and then of course can we measure it. So Andrew Sayer, who I think is well known in this crowd, has made the case that dignity is something that's very clearly important to people, but it's an elusive concept. A whole lot of the founding fathers of sociology have suggested that dignity is something important to the human condition. Lamont, much more recently, and Hodson, who's done a lot of work trying to measure this in the organizational context, suggest dignity has something to do with autonomy and a sense of self-respect. The philosopher Waldron sort of differentiates between a sense of honor versus a sense of worth. Goffman talked about dignity in terms of the ability to maintain your dignity within a particular situation, which is sort of a different treatment of it. Chris Smith, again, kind of central to this enterprise in America, says dignity is a brute fact of humanity. Right? This is not a variable. This is a thing that the human condition offers because we are intersubjectively accountable and understand each other. Habermas, in a completely different tradition, suggests that because dignity exists, we have equal respect for people, thus we can have participatory discussion leading to democracy, ideally. So dignity, once we started reading about it and trying to dive into figuring out what it is, right, it's not something that's fully a property of the people or society itself. It seems to have something to do with how people are living up to societal standards. And it's a term, because it's so slippery, that seems to have some sense of individual freedom and personal projects, but also representing the social order. So we've become quite intrigued with this term that gets used in all these different ways. We suggest that dignity is the achievement of social personhood, which means getting to the point where your interactions with others in your intimate groups or your society, personhood, largely the way that Chris Smith talks about it, your dignity is sort of perhaps a measure of how well you're living up to those sorts of things. And we suggest, because of the sort of inextricable nature of moral being, we talked about earlier, that dignity has this moral component, and thus what we want to try to do is bring in some sense of humans as moral creatures into the social psychology, in both sociology and psychology, that tends to sort of reduce people to particular personality traits or drives or sort of very atomized understandings of the person. So we're going to try to make the case theoretically and then hopefully empirically that by talking about dignity, we're capturing this idea of a morally embedded social actor, right? Sort of the properties that have been discussed of morality itself. All right, so what we're trying to do with what I'm presenting today, we have a couple book chapters that start this. We have 2 empirical papers that Matt is probably working on it while we speak because he is indefatigable, is talk about, okay, what is the nature of dignity? And then because we're sociologists, is that thing distributed the same to people in different social locations? Where does it come from? And again, does it do anything? And so this is something we're going to play with for a while. I'll show you more about it, but that's the main thrust of what we're trying to do overall. I won't go through all that today. What happens when you really start to read about this is, Matt pointed out, because he did some of this early reading and when we started talking about it, that there are these sort of conflicting, the nature of dignity has these sort of three paradoxes. So, for example, dignity is something that, as Chris Smith said, is just ascribed to the human actor, right? It is fundamentally human, and yet we talk about how one has to achieve dignity situationally, like Goffman. And so we both have it, and we have to make it happen and keep it up at a certain level or act in a certain way in order to prove that we are dignified in some way. And so it's a concept that has these sort of paradoxical properties. Dignity is something that happens within situations, right? You need to maintain your poise in a certain way. And yet, as we construct a narrative about our lives, we'll talk about events that more sort of led to or subtracted from an overall sense of whether we've had a morally satisfactory life, I guess I'll say. And so dignity potentially exists in these sort of different time frames. And then a distinction that Stephen Lukes, who's now at NYU, makes about morality, we sort of just steal for this kind of exercise, which is to say that there's, dignity as experienced by the actor is different than dignity as seen from a third party, from somebody else. And so somehow this term has to do both with the subjective experience and the societal judgment of that experience. All right, this is probably coming across fairly small to the crowd. Matt was working on his dissertation with this data for a completely separate project, but he pointed out that the MIDAS study, the National Survey of Midlife Development in the United States, has a large series of psychological scales. And as we were reading and talking about dignity and trying to figure out how we would measure these various things, we have this data that, luckily for us, with a pretty decent sized sample, has a whole series of these scales that can be measured that were not necessarily grouped together, but we decided, well, what if we play with them? Because this is what we do for fun. And so we could go into the items, that's sort of secondary now, but there is a way to measure. We sort of have 11 aspects of those paradoxes I just told you, and that sort of we can get numbers for. The way that we do this in quantitative social psychology is we try to see how these 11 scales work together. And it turns out if you try to fold them together into one thing, which we're calling dignity, you get some pretty decent math. So I won't belabor this, but it's very empirically defensible to say that there is something holding together all of these different aspects of the individual, and given that some of these aspects match up differentially with each other, right, we're saying, well, there is this thing that we could call dignity, which captures a lot of these different ends of the paradox, and yet mathematically they work together. The most important part for dignity in this world would seem to be measures of self-respect. And then measures of mastery, like your ability to control the world, and then trust, like are you embedded in warm relations? And so those are the three things that are the most important. Things like are you hardworking and responsible? They fit, they don't work as well. We're trying to decide whether or not they're in there. But what we get is a measure that psychology would probably scream about because we're trying to put too much into one thing, but there is some capacity of the human being that we can start to measure that, at least empirically, holds together in some certain way. Now, if you have statistical training, this will make more sense, but the first column with numbers, we're trying to predict who has more or less of this thing that we're calling dignity. So being married is good for this sense, having a job is good for this. The more money you make, the more of this sort of overall self-respect measure thing you have. It's good to be a man in this and as in so many other structural advantage things. And the older we get, the more we develop this sort of thing. So one part of what we want to sort of explore is where does this thing come from? And then the second two columns of numbers are basically taking one of the most studied outcomes in psychology and sociology in terms of sort of mental health. And the column one sort of is the usual predictors of mental health, right? As you get older, it gets a little gets a little worse, and I'm sorry, gets a little better, and then working is also very good for mental health. When we add our particular strange measure, turns out to be a very strong predictor of mental health, and so whether you have this dignity. So you get this sense through some structural advantage positions, and it turns out to be very psychologically good for you. In fact, it's a much better predictor than the typical things that the literature uses to predict mental health, right? And more accurately, what I should say is a lack of this sense of dignity is really bad for you. And so we're trying to figure out sort of how to frame this such that the mental health scholars would be interested, because this gets awfully philosophical for many of them. So basically what I say, for a totally different kind of project, dignity, we're saying there's a thing, we can sort of measure it, and it at least behaves mathematically for us, and it tells us some things. So Matt's found some other data sets, as he does, and so we're comparing this to measures, and we're trying to beat this to death that's how we do it in social psych. But the overall idea is whether there is something called dignity that we can talk about that might be a useful measure. Perhaps we can have a more morally embedded understanding of the person than we currently do with things like self-esteem and whatnot. One of the things that we like about this is that we can remain agnostic about the moral commitments people are making. We're just measuring whether they think they're living up to them. So because people at different statuses in society might have some different moral commitments, we don't have to worry about that, but we think dignity is a measure of whether you are living up to the moral commitments of your particular community. So to try to tie all this together, I don't know if I do, but my sort of view as a empirical social psych person is that society was there before us. It shapes sort of individual codes that we have, the values and the moral options that we consider most important. Those aspects of the self go into situations, and a whole lot of what I teach in my undergraduate social psych course is about how situations override our personal codes so that we do not act the way we think we would act. There's lots of classic studies about that. And then what I think happens afterwards in society, and a lot of the cultural sociology work I think supports this, which is society gives us a lot of ways to rationalize the behavior that we did that may not, I should say, live up to our personal codes. And so what I try to do with this umbrella is see what we can measure and how we can understand things. I think some of Vasey's work also fits into this idea that the cultural understandings are out there, they get into us, they may or may not affect us in situations, but we like to think that we are morally good people. And so there are all sorts of ways that we can rationalize all sorts of actions to maintain this belief that I should have some dignity, I should have some worth, and my codes are in fact important, even if I didn't live up to them. All right, so that's the long overview I had here of a lot of things, and I look forward to feedback.
So thanks so much for that. So now on to the question answer time. I guess one question that's come through concerns, if you like, the kind of critical potential of the sociology of morality. And so you started out with Durkheim, and as I'm sure you know, he had this aspiration for sociology to be a moral science. It was always a little unclear exactly what he meant by that, but he certainly thought that there would be some way in which sociology could contribute positively to the moral development or the moral health of societies. What's your view about that, and what is the view more generally about that amongst people working nowadays in the sociology of morality?
So my understanding is, as Durkheim was sort of almost a relativist in the sense that there was no one right answer across societies. And it was more that, we should use the tools of this fledgling social science within any particular society to figure out what is good for people and social structures in that society. And then with these tools, we can go to the policymakers and the politicians and sort of suggest to them what's going on. I have to say, I was a philosophy major in undergrad. I get nervous sort of advocating particular things in the abstract about how people should be, except that in one's private life you can't you can't ignore that there's certain ways of being that are others. And so what I think, I sort of dodge this question by saying, what I want to help get to is a better understanding of how these processes might work, how we can measure them, and then from there, let people who have more moralistic claims, politicians and religious leaders and such, to sort of go out and advocate for these things. That said, I'm a little swayed when I read stuff by Andrew Sayer and whatnot that's saying, like, look, right, some things are good for people and some aren't, and we should be less afraid of saying that. So I would say in the American Sociological Association, there is a relatively new section called Altruism, Morality, and Social Solidarity. And it's a broad tent, and I would say within that we have some pretty interesting discussions between people who are taking this sort of more Weberian approach, which is don't tell anyone what they should do, just give them the facts about how the world works. And there are a lot of people within that section and that movement that take the stronger thing, which is, look, we know certain things are good for people in society, so let's go advocate for them. So I personally dodge the question a little by just not wanting to tell people how to live their life, but I think as I raise a child, I'm going to have stronger opinions and maybe weigh in a little more. So I don't think there's a way that this movement treats things. I'd say I'm on the little slightly more scientifically based side in the sense of the is and not the ought. But I could be nudged, as some people, Chris Smith also, are convincing on that we should be doing more of the ought. So it's a complete dodge of your question, but that's sort of how I would frame what's happening. Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe just to make it even a little bit more specific, what about the sort of closing findings that you had about the importance of dignity and its relationship to mental health?
Yeah, I mean, if we can convince people that these things are good, and this is an area actually in which it sort of butts up against more scientific practitioners, right? Like we establish, if we believe that there are ways to measure health, mental health, then people are out there advocating these things are better for that. And, I think we could comfortably go along that. What happens is people don't always agree on that we should have mental health that we should have a single definition of what mental health is. And so you get pushback when you do these things. But yeah, I think if we can create conditions that increase some of these feelings, that's good. The problem, and this is one of the things we're debating, so within psychology for 30 years, self-esteem has been a major focus. I think it's dying down a little bit. But the idea was self-esteem it's sort of a reflective sense that people have of themselves. This is a good thing. And so for a long time, and Doonesbury once made fun of this in California, there was a task force on raising kids' self-esteem, and there was all this stuff. Then some more recent work comes out, and people point out that serial killers and sociopaths have incredibly high self-esteem. And so you end up with this sort of situation in which you're pushing for people to feel better about themselves, but if you feel good about yourselves without reason, then you just end up being very dangerous because it's easily puncturable. I don't want to make any political comments these days, but there are people in the world who, when threatened, get very angry because they have a high sense of self-esteem, but it's sort of fragile. And so I don't want to get the cart ahead of the horse in terms of what the things are that are good. It does seem like having a sense of belonging and trustingness is good for one's mental health. So I think I can comfortably say that. But I could see a world in which trusting the wrong people and whatnot could become sort of a bad thing. And so one of the things that I think Matt and I want to do is sort of figure out, do the different parts of the scale balance out in some way that we can say we've got a better measure of mental health. And I'm not sure I'm quite ready to say that, but it would be nice if, in terms of the way Seligman in psychology talks about human flourishing, that I know Chris Smith has talked about, if we can say these things are good for human flourishing, we have a way of sort of figuring out what causes them. So I'll take some tentative steps in that direction, I guess.
Okay, so I have another question that follows on pretty nicely from the previous one. Given your remarks about self-esteem. So one person was wondering how dignity is different from self-esteem and self-respect, and whether you think that the components of those three things would be culturally variable.
So that's a great question. And so one of the things that we're trying to argue theoretically and empirically a bit elsewhere is to say, okay, so self-esteem and self-respect, the way that they're measured in psychology is very much about a person and their own sort of solipsistic is too strong, but sort of their own view of themselves. What we like about dignity is we're defining it theoretically, and whether we're doing this empirically is up for debate, but theoretically we're saying it's not just about self-esteem whether I like myself, but we're trying to fold in the moral evaluations of the community in some way, so that having a sense of dignity, right? People who are doing things that we would consider quite immoral, you know, crime families or, you know, TV bad guys, might have a strong sense of dignity because they're living up to their local codes, and we're trying to fold in that sense of I'm living up to my moral community in a way that the self-esteem literature and the self-respect don't capture as much of the outside standards. So certainly they're in there, and some of the items that we have in our big mishmash are self-esteem items, I think, as 2 or 3 from the scale. So it builds upon that, but what we're trying to do as sociologists is somehow capture embedded within this the sense that the person's part of a social community or multiple communities, that's a later problem, and that we want to sort of build in how you're living up to the standards while remaining agnostic about the standards. So the theoretical move we make, I like. I'm not sure that I've convinced myself, much less the audience yet. We're still working on these papers, that there's an empirical basis for this. That's what we're playing with.
Okay, great. So I have another question now. I think this follows on of this little interchange. So this has to do with whether you're concerned about the fragility of self-esteem maps onto the paradoxes with having a state and achieving a state of dignity. And could this be related to mental health, so that mental health describes different states if it's achieved versus having it? Does that make sense?
Somewhat. So the idea is, do our measures have to do with, I can try to pull them up here, are we capturing these kinds of, does self-esteem have to do with both of this?
I think that's what they're asking, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, question mark. I think what we're trying to do is sort of say, because self-esteem, it has this long tradition in both psychology, and sociology has used it for a while too, as sort of an indicator, right? The self-esteem itself is some kind of thermometer for how you're doing. A guy named Leary, a psychologist, I think he's at Duke now, has what he calls sociometer theory, which is basically your self-esteem goes up if you're doing well with your friends or something, and goes down if it doesn't. I'm not sure if I've thought about it as something that's both ascribed and achieved in that sense, right? I mean, there is a sense in which you develop a sense of esteem through feedback of others, so it's something that you can achieve, although you can't control it all, because, you know, people with advantaged positions in society, you know, sort of straight white men in American society, you get an outside bonus that sort of feeds our self-esteem without having earned it. So it can be ascribed and achieved, but I'm not certain. I mean, what we're trying to do is say, like, I guess I should back up a second. Within sociology and the kinds of things that Matt and I do, sort of social structure and individual outcomes, there's a lack of focus on the individual end, I think, because my home discipline of social psych has too many measures and too much stuff for many sociologists to bother to learn. And so there's this call for, we need a better understanding of mechanisms, but for good reasons. A lot of people don't want to have to learn the sheer range of stuff. So what we're trying to do, I maybe should have said the meta point of this, is to give people something that lets them say we have a version of the individual without having to learn all of the literature about self-esteem, self-efficacy, there's I think someone counted as 283 self measures at last count in psychology. And we're trying to say, look, we're going to give you a pretty broad measure, but something that will let you measure the individual without having to get bogged down into the difference between self-esteem and self-respect, that kind of thing. So how that maps onto, I mean, the paradox becomes, can we capture both meanings in a single measure? So the answer seems to be it does kind of work. We haven't played it out all the way back for each measure, all the way back to the theoretical part. I have to think a little more about that. So I don't think I have a very good answer for that.
Well, it was a tough question. A couple of other folks were, I think, more intrigued by the other paper, the one on inequality and social inequality and moral emotion, which was really kind of striking. Also, the way that it cross-cut the East-West divide that is so commonly referenced in social psychology. So one question really was just about how you want to think about causation there, right? Does is it something about the culturally grounded mix of moral emotions in a society which leads to a greater or lesser acceptance of inequality? So, I don't know, when, certainly people have argued, that there's something about the kind of reformed Protestant culture in England and the United States, that kind of associates wealth with moral dignity, and therefore is going to be more accepting of greater levels of inequality, or is it the other way around? I mean, does the causal arrow, in fact, run from social inequality in the sense that maybe social equality causes, or perhaps more aptly suppresses certain kinds of certain moral emotions, so that people in more equal societies would then be expected to have a wider range of moral emotions because they don't have to suppress some of them to sort of deal with or live with the very high levels of inequality that surround them.
Right. Yeah, so the causal question is probably the fundamental and one that we can't get close to approaching with this kind of data, because these are sort of particular years that have measured these. So we'd have to track things over time, compare them to a Gini. And so we make the claim that with this data, and I think there's a lot of new big data things that might get to speak to this better, and I have to talk to some people about how we would scroll through sort of newspapers and magazines and track some of this better over time. What we're saying, though, I just want to make clear that these emotions that we're reporting are not even about whether inequality is good or not, right? We're sort of attaching that on. What these emotions that we're reporting say is kind of like, in a given day, someone's going to get in a line at a restaurant and then get on a bus and then sit next to somebody, then go to office work meetings. And during that day, you're going to feel a variety of emotions. And what we're suggesting is that more of the sort of harsh judgment emotions seem to appear in China and the United States on average using this strange measure. So it's not a measure of how we feel about inequality. It's saying that the way we slice this up is that there are more of these sanctioning types of emotions in a society that seems to have this inequality, right? And the causality, we're claiming, well, we think the inequality comes first, except language is sort of actually a pretty durable construct according to these measures. And so we're making a claim that the inequality is the way to carve this up, but I'm not sure, and that it will serve to maintain those kinds of relationships that by the society with more judgments, sort of says, well, then the people below me should stay that way, versus the more harmonious ones. We borrow a bit, I didn't mention it here, there's a psychologist, Susan Fiske, who has a book called Envy Up, Scorn Down, and her argument is in American society, but depending on where you are in the stratification structure, you're more likely to feel either envy the people ahead of you or scorn going down. And we sort of say, well, there's a bigger thing going on, which is that everyone in the unequal society seems to feel more scorn, both of those sort of negative emotions that are non-binding. So, like I said, we're trying to be pretty clear that we're going to claim that the economic comes first, but we have no way to test that at all, or to justify that. It's just sort of social structure is pretty obstinate, and so we begin there. But ideally, someone will pick a fight with us and argue with us and find some different kind of data to get into this.
Do you think that social equality or inequality is, in some sense, maybe then like a proxy for social or moral distance as experienced in everyday interaction, so that, more unequal society, people are more apt to have harsh views of others because they view the others who surround them as being sort of more morally distant or socially distant from themselves, and perhaps in that sense somewhat less entitled to respect? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm sitting here trying to figure out where we'd find measures of sort of social distance. Like, part of the beauty of what we can do here is the Gini gives us a number that we can play with. There are all sorts of other kinds of diversity, and we don't we don't go through whether religious diversity or yeah, this sort of distance thing. We don't know if it is. Those are, I guess, would be good beating hypothesis. So yeah, I don't know whether it's the David Brooks idea that you just are sitting with people like you at the lunch table, and so that would be the opposite of what you're saying, though, right? Like you have to use this to justify the types of diversity. I'd have to figure out if there's a measure of social distance by how much you interact with people like that are different. That's a great idea. I'm not sure how to measure it, but we could definitely play with that. Yeah. Like I said, it's a very crude instrument we have, and only 5 countries, and blah blah blah. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting variants that I need to find a big data friend. So if anyone on this knows how to play well with big data and wants to like think of other ways to test some of these with some different versions, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, it's a very thought-provoking finding, that's for sure. I mean, something that does make you want to dig a little bit deeper. Another question that's somewhat related to this is whether you think this might be a mediating mechanism linking inequality to crime or other forms of moral deviance, like corruption or.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer for that. There is another way that the world gets divided in terms of I don't have a slide on it. Punishment. I forget what the criminologists call it. But basically, how punitive is your society in terms of death penalty? China laps the field and sort of is more than everybody combined. The United States is second in terms of the death penalty, and so we originally thought there might be something. This does represent sort of views towards people that break the moral code. The issue, though, the difference between China and the United States on that measure is so big that it doesn't quite fit with what we. It's one of the alternative hypotheses we offer, but it's you can't group people the way we do there because China just runs away with the with sort of the murder rate in terms of getting rid of people that aren't there. So I don't know how it matches onto crime rates. I think the United States crime rate is actually much higher, and so it's a great idea. And again, my dodge is our data don't quite give us enough nuance to get at that, but it certainly might be part of it.
Yeah. So I guess we now have a sort of a more general question about your theoretical orientation, since you do seem to be concerned with the way in which socialization shapes morality and the way in which socialization practices change over time and the way in which they're influenced by social structure. And this is put in one person's mind the work of Norbert Elias, and they were just curious if Elias had been an influence on you or not so much.
So only in the crass sense that he wrote, I believe, the German Habitus or a book, and so part of what we do in our book is try to make the case, and it's not even one I fully believe, but we're trying to make the case there that society at the national level is a meaningful measurement unit. And so he suggests, right, that there are deep patterns of, in his case, German society, that play themselves out in the habituses, I don't know what plural is, of people over time, so that even though there's a lot of variation within any society, German society, American society, there is sort of a central tendency that we can point to say, and if people that have traveled abroad more than me will say, right, oh, that's very American, that's very Brazilian, that's very Russian, South African. Right? There are these stereotypes of societies that have a kernel of truth, and so only in the sense that I used him to sort of justify what the claim we're making there, which is that the societies are a unit of measurement, even though it obscures within society variation. Deeper than that, I can't claim to have done much more deeply than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's another big think question, which is concerns how the increasing influence of social media influences moral codes of conduct. I mean, certainly it's been a lot of commentary of late about the way in which social media seem to kind of bring out really sort of, kind of or at least enable really sort of nasty interactions between people. And I guess I think the question here is this something that just happens on social media, or is this something you think you see any evidence that this sort of nastiness, if you like, is rippling out into wider society?
I don't know, because I don't want to fall into a sort of kids today argument. My understanding for sort of the media that I grew up with before a lot of this was a Durkheimian, in the sense of those stories that make the news, that make a ripple, that people pick up on, and today we'd say those things that go viral. The Durkheimian approach would be, well, that signals some sort of deep violation of something, right? The reason we're paying attention to it, the reason it gets a reaction, is because it's something in society that we, it's something that's it's damaging the fabric of society, or that people think it does. How that can get accelerated now by everyone having a voice, it's kind of hard to say, because so much of, the last slide that I have on here too, in terms of how people actually act, is that you have a reaction, and in face-to-face, the pressures to suppress those interactions are very strong. Randall Collins has a whole book. I'm not sure if I entirely agree with all of it, but it's convincing to the extent that when you actually look at violence and photos of violence, right, like it's a very high threshold for people to actually physically get into conflict with each other. When you look at it, a lot of people are watching and standing to the side, or trying not to get into sort of conflict. And so human beings really don't like to have face-to-face angriness or nastiness, right? In a car is different than face. So there are these terrible pressures to do that. Online, without those normal interactional backstops, right, you can just have whatever reaction you want, and tweet it out and send it to people. And one of the things that this is not social science, just anecdotally, the famous people I listen to on podcasts or whatnot, they'll get a very angry, insulting comment or tweet or something. Sometimes if they contact that person will reply and say, "Oh my God, I'm sorry, I didn't think you read this." And then a lot of the quote unquote normal reparative things that Goffman talks about kick into play. And so it's a little hard to say. People's worst impulses can be let out without the situational pressures to keep them in line, is sort of a problem. I don't know how much the online universe intersects with the real world interview, whatever they call it, in real life. So as I age, I start thinking, like, good God, this stuff is terrible, and the college students today, it's a much more meaningful thing to be insulted online than it is for my generation. But I want to be a little cautious not to be the same way that so many generations are, tracing back to Socrates, like, well, these kids today are just ruining everything and they're making society fall apart. So I'm sympathetic to that view, but I don't want to go too far down that road, because every generation thinks the next one is sort of blowing up the whole society.
Right. So one more question here, which goes again to these issues around social deviance. This is from somebody who's studying religion and gangs in El Salvador, and I guess this is about the tension between moral commitments that people in a really intense subculture like a street gang make, the tension between the sort of moral commitments and expectations within that subculture and those within the broader society.
Yeah, well, I'm glad people are exploring that. So one of the things with the first half of what we're talking about here, so I should say that the examples I'm giving of how to study morality are, because they're sort of distance quantitative, right? They're sort of distorting what I think the actual lived experience of morality is. I'm just not patient enough or brave enough or talented enough to go actually study it. But one of the things that Vasey and I were trying to make the case for, which is the theories that psychologists sitting in their offices have about justice and harm and how people should orient the world, are going to look very different if you actually go and hang out with people who are in specific situations with pressures. And so according to the old theories, gangs are a bunch of immoral or amoral people who are just sort of not living up to some sort of abstract Aristotelian code or something crazy, right? But my understanding, if you read about that or talk to most human beings, most people think they are doing at least a morally okay thing, right? They may know that it's not what sort of wider society thinks, but supporting your friends, being loyal to your group, these are very important virtues. And so how people juggle that is what I'm fascinated by that. what we try to do with this sort of Dust Bowl empiricism stuff that I'm doing with Matt is like, well, can we get at some of that? But it's nothing like the actual richness of talking to people who are dealing with this. It just while I'm on this, I don't know if people who are listening to this, there's a television show on NBC called The Good Place, which is the premise is people have died and they're in heaven or whatnot. They talk about there was an episode a few weeks ago on this famous trolley problem, and the trolley problem is this sort of philosophical exercise that gets used in psychology a lot for, you're on a bridge and a train's coming below you and it's about to kill 5 people, and should you flip a switch and save the 5 people by sending it to a new track that'll kill 1 person? And it's used in all these ways, and it's incredibly boring after a while for how they've used this simple problem, which you have different moral whatever. The thing that the TV show does that what I found pretty entertaining was, rather than sitting in an office deciding what to do, is that the person with unlimited power in the show takes the characters and sticks them in a trolley aimed right at 5 people, and they have to make this decision in real life, and of course they mess it up and people die, and so then he does it again. And so the difference between what I'm doing in an office trying to figure out how people did surveys and somebody who's on the front lines with actual people, I hope that we can develop some sort of law-like claims that the people that are on the front lines can see if they bear up, and talk about how actual human beings in actual difficult situations talk about juggling those things, or maybe actually do juggle them, in turns will help us figure out some more realistic things that we can put into the introductory social psych textbooks.
Okay, great, Steve. So now I'm going to, as we're sort of approaching the end of the webinar, I'm going to throw a couple of sort of bigger picture philosophical questions at you. And the first one is both philosophical and pedagogical. So one listener is wondering if it would be possible to tie your conception of dignity to the kind of psychological and philosophical idea of character, which some folks have been trying to bring back, both in philosophy and in psychology, as I'm sure you know. And if so, if you could use the conception of dignity in some way to sort of build better forms of character education in schools, I'm guessing is what they're thinking about.
Yeah, we talked a little about that. There was an exploratory grant I think we tried for by some psychologists who just didn't like all this societal stuff, or however we put in, and we were trying to sort of argue that when people talk about character, we can offer a way that gets at those sorts of embedded ability to do positive things without some of the measurement that we had seen for how people do character. So I think there could be something to that. We're pretty early in this, so I'm not sure that I would want anyone to put a pedagogical program around it. But I think it is an interesting link to make. I don't know enough about the character studies and how they relate to sort of the virtue philosophy that I used to read to make a really strong claim about that. But intuitively, there's something there, I think.
Right. Well, all right, so the closing question, and this does not come from me, though I'm, of course, very happy to pose it, is just, what if anything, about critical realism have you found useful or interesting or inspiring in thinking about your own work?
Yeah, I have to say it's upsetting. And as I understand it, I went to some of the early discussions around ASA and these kinds of things. I was with a group talking to Seligman about how to create sort of a positive sociology that would mirror positive psychology. And it ends up, just at a personal level, being challenging in the sense of, I came through, Phil would know this, a program in which we're supposed to just do, science, quote unquote, and just measure reality the best we can, and the is and the ought are very separate. And as I get older and a little more judgmental, the critical realism sort of has pushed me to think like, well, how far can we go towards making these sorts of claims like they came up earlier, right? Some things seem better for humans than others. Some things are better for flourishing. Some things instill more character. And can we make those claims? And so I find myself sort of inching that way. And then a whole lot of training pulls me back and saying, but, who are you to know this? So to that extent, it just sort of has unsettled me more and given me some people whose careers I really respect who are advocating this in a way that I think, well, I need to take this more seriously. I'm not sure that's a great answer because I'm still sort of playing around in it, but following Sayer's work, and Sayer was in our handbook, and Chris Smith and Phil and Steinmetz and a whole bunch of people who are sort of amazing scholars. It sort of opened me up to some things that I thought I wasn't supposed to think about, and I can't pretend that I've resolved it yet.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Steve. We have kind of run to the end of our time here, I'm afraid, and I do apologize to anybody out there whose question I was not able to pass on to Steve. And I'd like to thank people also for tuning in, and hope that you'll come back for future webinars. So thanks again, Steve. It was really a pleasure kind of chatting with you and getting into this kind of crash course in the sociology of morality. So thanks again.